Right. Well, thank you and welcome everyone to this this webinar. My name is Ines Osman and I'm the Executive Director of NHRIs Group. I'm very pleased to be accompanied by great speakers today. So we have Mohamed Ebaid, who is Human Rights and Legal Analyst and Project Director at the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms. We have Brian Dooley, who is Senior Advisor at Human Rights First, and Shomira Sanyal, who is Program Officer at Forum Asia. We are also waiting for Jawad Fairouz, the Director of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, who will be joining us shortly. So the topic of today is, does the evaluation of national human rights institutions need reform? A conversation around the upcoming accreditation of Bahrain and Egypt's human rights bodies. So I have to say I'm very happy we're having this this conversation, because the topic of national human rights institutions and the review process and the importance, the role they should be playing at the domestic level is pretty much underlooked, and something that civil society is not always aware of and has not necessarily engaged with very much. So to give a bit of background, next week, the national human rights institutions of Bahrain and Egypt will be reviewed by a body called the Subcommittee on Accreditation of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. And today, the objective of the conversation is to first understand what is this review process, how it works, what are the shortcomings and maybe potential solutions. And in this context, we're also going to be addressing the role of civil society in the process and how can increased participation hopefully also improve the effectiveness of that review. And secondly, we're also going to be hearing from experts, respectively from Egypt and Bahrain, about the national human rights institutions of both countries, their shortcomings, and what should be done for them to abide by the Paris principles and effectively play their role to promote and defend human rights on the ground. I see we have Jawad Fairouz, who's joined us. Thank you, Jawad, for being with us today. So without further ado, I want to turn to you, Shomira, first. So I understand that your organization, Forum Asia, has been engaging with the Subcommittee on Accreditation in the past ahead of the review of national human rights institutions. And I would like us to kind of walk us through the review process, explain like how it works, how can civil society engage. And I also understand that you've sometimes faced a couple of challenges with that engagement. Yeah, so if you could share some of that experience with us, that would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines, and thank you for having me, and also, of course, a warm hello to everyone here. If I can just quickly walk you through the work that my organization has been doing. So I'm representing Forum Asia, which is the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development. And Forum Asia is the secretariat of the Asian NGOs network on national human rights institutions, which we call ANI. So ANI is, you could say, a one-of-a-kind network in the sense that we have members from across 18 countries in Asia who are working specifically on advocacy on national human rights institutions. So in my role, I coordinate the work of this network. And one large part of it is, of course, not only doing national level advocacy on NHRIs, but also engaging with regional and international networks of NHRIs, and therefore also the Gundry SCA process. So ANI as a network and its members have been submitting reports to the Gundry SCA, stakeholder submissions, for almost the last 15 years. And the way the process would work is that you might see this on the Gundry website as well, and also on the OHCHR website. The moment we get to know that dates are announced for the next accreditation and which countries will be up for review, we would liaise with our members and see whether they would be interested in making a submission to this process. So it might seem that sometimes submissions are often critical, but that's not always the case. We've also worked with members where we felt that NHRIs have been upholding Paris principles quite strongly in their national context. And in those cases as well, we've submitted reports to applaud the work of the national human rights institutions where they deserve the credit. At the same time, the stakeholder submission process is, you could say that this is a one window for civil society to express the concerns that they have before an international mechanism of this nature, especially in contexts where we find that the NHRIs are not performing satisfactorily, or where there have been concerns about the performance of the NHRI or other situations which impact the functioning of the NHRI. So this is one window for civil society to raise their concerns to the Gundry SCA, because we do have that window of opportunity. And we try our best to ensure that, of course, our reports are as thorough as possible. We do try to focus on writing it from the perspective of the Paris principles, so that the SCA body itself can tally the performance against the principles itself of the NHRI, whether they have been complying with these or not. A note over here is that while there are larger NGOs or organizations that are well established who are regularly participating in the process, it could further be strengthened by submissions from smaller organizations. So the process itself is open to organizations and civil society organizations broadly. So it's not just a process where the larger organizations can participate. And in my opinion, I think it would be very good and it's important to make people aware, other organizations aware of the existence of this mechanism and their right to participate in it. And as you rightly mentioned, that people aren't very aware about this process, and there needs to be more awareness so that we can have a rich background into the work and functioning of the NHRI in question. When we talk about some of the challenges very briefly, one of the challenges in our experience has been is not knowing whether your submission has really been read or discussed before the SCA in the way you would hope for it to be discussed, because they do receive a lot of submissions, and we're not always very sure whether all the information submitted has been taken into account. And also, there's not a lot of follow-up with the CSOs making the submissions themselves. So it can be the process of submitting it and not really knowing sometimes what has happened with it or where it stands. Along with this, larger NGOs or networks or more established NGOs and networks who have been familiar with the process might still have the opportunity to find informal ways of trying to receive updates, what the situation is with the accreditation system, the process, what are some updates coming out of the accreditation system, if at all. But what about the smaller organizations? They may not have access to contacts and persons who might be able to update them about the process itself. So this could also be a challenge in terms of access. And even for those who have been participating in this process, who've been partaking in this process, the opportunity for civil society to formally present their points or their concerns before the SCA. So we do know that the SCA speaks with the NHRIs who are going to be accredited or will be undergoing the accreditation process. But there isn't much room for CSOs to have the same audience with the SCA as well. So while we might make a submission, we don't know if the SCA might be curious about some of our points or might have questions as well or follow-up. And I'm sure that civil society organizations are more than happy to furnish information if called upon to do so. But this can sometimes make the process feel a bit one-sided at times. We're also hearing that there might be a more streamlined process that might come up and a standardized process for submissions for civil society. So it's important that we understand that while this can certainly help reduce the burden of all of this information that is going to the SCA on those who are reviewing the submissions, for example, civil society already doesn't have a lot of space to raise their concerns. So if there are further ways to sort of streamline the process in terms of having formats to submit your information, or for example, if civil society itself is not consulted in this process, then it could once again restrict our participation and the space to share our perspectives. So, if someone wants to write in 50 pages, might not be able to write in more than 5. And this could severely limit the space for them to share what they would like to speak about. My last challenge in this that I would like to highlight is that some NHRIs who are under accreditation and review, and this might resonate with some of the speakers here as well, is that they tend to raise concerns about the motives or the credibility of CSOs who submit reports on them. And this poses a challenge to the important work of documentation that civil society is doing over and above the already challenging context that CSOs tend to work in. So when CSOs or networks are trying to submit their information, if they're also being questioned about their credibility or their motives, and we do see that there are now a lot of countries with authoritarian regimes, this takes on a completely different form. And CSOs are doing a lot of important work on this. So these can be some of the challenges if NHRIs are the only ones who are being privileged in the process in terms of sharing information or directing the way information can be submitted. So I think I will stop over there, and I'm happy to hear from other speakers about their perspectives too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamira, for walking us through the process. And I guess already hinting to the part that I want to get to at the end of this webinar, on like how can civil society be more included in the process, and how can we have also our views as well, I guess, better echoed in this process and in the recommendations of the SCA. Brian, I would like to turn to you now. I would be curious to hear your views on what is the role that national human rights institutions should be playing globally. Like, why is this an important topic? And why does it matter that, you know, NHRIs have like uphold actually principles of independence and impartiality that are set under the Paris principles? And perhaps if you can also share with us a little bit challenges that are specific to national human rights institutions in the MENA region. Obviously, we're going to be talking about Egypt and Bahrain, but many NHRIs actually are facing the same issues all over the region. So if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, now, can you hear me? All right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for organizing this and for asking me to talk. Just a little bit of overall context here. You know, about 35 years ago, when I actually started doing human rights work for Amnesty International, it was a sort of an optimistic time, right? The Cold War had just ended. Most of the military dictatorships in Latin America had gone. Apartheid was over. And there was a huge fresh international enthusiasm for human rights and international human rights standards, right? You had the setting up of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, various special rapporteurs started to pepper the mechanisms, and the Paris Principles and the system of NHRIs was established, and that was all a good thing. Now, I don't think we were ever naive enough to think that all these things would work perfectly. But what's happened really is, by and large, these things have been, even at best, very mixed. They've been instrumentalized by and exploited and used as cover by governments all around the world who have no interest in promoting human rights, and in fact, often the opposite. So any country can set up an NHRI. They don't all have to look the same, which I think is an advantage. There are different flavors of them. Some are more like ombudsman's offices for complaints. Some are NHRIs, some are hybrids. And about half the countries in the world have done this. 96, I think. It depends how you count it, but we usually think there's around 200 countries in the world. Now, some are pretty good. And if I might just for a second, some of my own countries, Ireland is a good example, right? It's independent, it's well respected. More to the point, I think, which is a failing of some NHRIs, is that the public knows it exists and roughly what it does. Part of the problem generally, and if I can overgeneralize here, is that even when NHRIs exist and they're doing a sort of an okay to good job, they're not really well known within their publics. Some are awful. Worse than useless. Bahrain and Egypt, the Emirates says it's got one. I mean, it's not just that these things are wasting money; they're actually counterproductive to human rights. Some countries, like the US, just don't bother having one at all. So half countries have them. Of those, some are good, some are in between, and some are awful. So in terms of the accreditation process, yes, of course, it needs to be stiffer because, you know, once it's shown to be so weak as it is, then it really it reflects even on the good NHRIs, right? If the standard is so low and abusive governments can get an A grade, best grade for the NHRIs, then it really diminishes the credibility and the standing of everybody in the system. I don't think it should be abolished as an accreditation system, and I get that it's hard to reform. I mean, sometimes you hear this argument too about you know, a terrible country getting elected to the Human Rights Council, and that's awful, right? But actually very difficult to fix. So I think rather than scrapping the idea that people had 30 years ago, it's better to really put in place a rigorous process of reform. But you know, let's also be realistic here. Everyone complains about the UN, and with good reason, but the UN is just a club of all these almost 100 countries, some of whom are absolutely terrible, right? So to set and maintain a standard which is policed by all these other countries, including some of the really abusive ones, is going to be very difficult. But at some point, those countries which are rightly proud of their own NHRIs need to publicly come forward and say, look, the accreditation process has got to mean something, or else really it undermines the value of our own accreditation that we're getting. I'll stop there now because I know the time is tight, and we'll have other times to come back to this. But if very quickly, Egypt, Bahrain should not be given either A or B or any other standard. They're not real NHRIs, right? They don't have public trust. The international community knows that they're useless. We're going through a bit of a game here where other countries pretend that there's a real NHRI and there isn't.
Thank you so much, Brian, for these thoughts. And yeah, I really agree with your suggestions, and we can get back to that later. But it's true that sometimes we think about focusing on the bad things and maybe targeting also really good NHRIs and express these concerns with them and say, look, if you're in the same group as Egypt, for example, it also undermines your own credibility. I think it's a really good point, and perhaps advocacy kind of strategy that we can use in the future. So it's actually a perfect transition to Mohammed, who is going to be talking about Egypt. And in fact, it's quite concerning that the Egyptian NHRI has had status A actually since 2006, despite its many flaws. And I think it's also perhaps a striking example of when civil society perspective has not really been taken into account by the SCA in the past. So Mohammed, I would love to hear from you, like, what are the most problematic issues about the Egyptian Human Rights Commission, both in law and practice?
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me here. And yes, it's really perfect transition, because I was already thinking to begin my presentation with a question: is it really important, or the National Human Rights Council in Egypt, is it really important to talk about? And the response for that, the reply, it's no. Actually, it's not important at all. The National Human Rights Council in Egypt, it's just an institution for propaganda, which is already used since the time of Mubarak. It was established in 2003 with the law, just to make some propaganda for the international community that we have a Council for Human Rights, that we are trying to improve the human rights situation in Egypt, but it's actually not true at all. It's, as I'm saying, it's just formality for propaganda. And it's not only not important for, like, in the view of the human rights organizations in Egypt, but also for the regime itself. The National Human Rights Council in Egypt, it's not important for the regime, because they know very well that it's under the authority of the executive authority in Egypt. They don't have any problem with the independence of this council, because they know that they are controlling the appointment of the members of this council. It's totally under the control of the government. So even the government in Egypt, they really don't care about this council. And I can prove that. The government in Egypt always trying to amend the laws to put more control on the independent institutions. like the judiciary, like in Egypt, because of the judiciary in Egypt, especially the High Constitutional Court or the Administrative Court, they were always doing a great work against the government or the executive authority in Egypt in the time of Mubarak. In 2019, the Egyptian government really tried to control this independence and undermine it through the constitutional amendment itself. So in 2019, the government issued a constitutional amendments which give the president the right to choose and appoint and dismiss the members and the president of the judicial courts, the judicial institutions in Egypt. That's only to put more control in these institutions. Also, regarding the regulatory institutions in Egypt, which have a bit some authority above the executive authority. The Egyptian government also tried to control that because the president in Egypt issued a law for the cases of dismissal of the president of these institutions, like the auditing organization in Egypt, which already like the president of this institution, he was dismissed by the president and he was put in jail because he issued some reports against the government of corruption. So you can feel very well that the Human Rights Council in Egypt, it's not important, so that they even didn't care to change the constitution or the laws related to this institution. So that's the main problem with that. The third problem, we can say that always the Egyptian government use the law to cover the violations. They issue a lot of laws to legalize the violations of human rights, to ensure impunity. And this is clear since 2013 till 2022, the Egyptian government, the parliament issued more than 1,400 laws just to cover the violations of human rights, to undermine the democracy, to ensure impunity for a lot of crimes, like the extrajudicial killing. It's already legalized through the terrorism law. The terrorism in Egypt, its definition is so short, you can't deal with this definition to criminalize the torture in Egypt. And this is the problem also with the Human Rights Council in Egypt, because always they deal with the violations which is already entitled in the law. So if the law doesn't mention the enforced disappearance, so we don't have enforced disappearance. If the law in Egypt doesn't say, like I can give you example, the crime of torture in Egypt, they put condition to say that this is torture or not. First condition, that the victim of torture should be accused. So if you are a prisoner and you are tortured, it's not torture. Also, if you are tortured, but not for the reason of getting a confession, it's not torture. So if you are accused and you were just tortured without any reason, it's not a torture. And the Human Rights Council also can't say that this is torture, because according to the law, it's not torture. So this is a problem also with the Human Rights Council in Egypt. I can talk more about the role of this council in the constitution and in the law itself. In the constitution, in the 2014 constitution, it's just one article talking about the independence councils, including the Human Rights Council, the Women Council, and the Council for the Children. This is the main councils, the independent council, according to the constitution. They said it's independence. It should issue reports regarding the situation or their work, like human rights work or the woman situation, the children's situation. This is the only article in the law, in the constitution, mentioning the Human Rights Council. The second article is Article 99 of the constitution, which is talking about that any violation for the human rights or freedoms, the Human Rights Council can appeal or can complain to the public prosecution about this violations. It never happened. Usually it never happened. So that's according to the constitution. According to the law, the council was established in 2003 with the law 94 for 2003, which was amended in 2017. It just put some rules for the appointment of the council, which is appointed by the parliament. And this is also one of the problems, because the parliament in the last elections for the parliament, it was controlled by the executive authority, especially with the intelligence and the state security in Egypt. So we can't say that the council will be independent at all if the parliament itself is not independent. So that's the second point regarding to the laws, which is more important for us. I have read also the report issued by MENA Rights Group and CFJ about the council. They mentioned a lot of problems regarding to the council. First of them, that the council doesn't have the authority to ratify the treaties related to human rights in Egypt. The government in Egypt, they will never actually give them this right. I don't think that. The second problem, that they are already cooperating with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt to issue report compatible with the statements and report of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is also reflect the lack of independence regarding the council. Also dealing with the complaints of the enforced disappearance or the torture or other violations of human rights. It's known that the council doesn't deal with these complaints. They don't respond to it. Usually they try to whitewash the face of the government regarding the torture. They always say that it's just individual cases. It's not a systematic pattern. Although all the human rights organizations in Egypt and their reports say that the torture is a systematic pattern always happening in most of the police stations and prisons. Regarding the enforced disappearance, also the council, they talk like for one time that there is some complaints about enforced disappearance, but they said it's not, we can't say that it's enforced disappearance because the anti-terrorism law already gave the policemen the right to forcibly disappearing persons for 28 days. So it's not actually enforced disappearance according to the law. Also regarding to the right to fair trial, the Human Rights Council always trying to say that the government is trying to, or the judiciary is trying to improve the right to fair trial. They always talk about the online renewal for the pre-detention as it's improving of the right to fair trial, but it's actually more undermining of the fair trial because it prevents the person or the accused person from the right to defend or to be in front of his judge. The council in Egypt have the right to visit the prisons. That's according to the law, but usually we even saw this in the movies in Egypt since the past, like even the old movies, that when there is a visit from the council or from the prosecution to the prison, they made the prison as a very good place with a lot of gardens, with libraries. The prisoners are so happy, they are reading, they are doing everything. That's always what is happening when we see a visit from the Human Rights Council to the prisons in Egypt. It's already prepared. They always ask for the permission from the public prosecution. The council itself, they mentioned before that sometimes they ask to visit prisons and they didn't get any response. So it's also under the control of the government. If the government wants them to visit the prison to make this type of propaganda, they just give them the permission. And other times, no, they can't. So that's the main problem of the council, which make me always say that it's not independence at all, and it doesn't worth to talk about.
Thank you so much for Mohammed for outlining these issues. And if I may add to this, I think what I find quite striking as well is that the members of the institution are clearly not independent and affiliated with the government. And exactly. Actually, the president and the vice president are both former diplomats, and the vice president of the Egyptian Commission was also the former campaign coordinator of LCC in both 2014 and 2018. So I think it really couldn't show any better, the affiliation of the commission with the executive, having someone clearly politically involved. Jawad,
also they,
sorry, no.
If I can add that they are already appointed by the parliament, which is appointed, or we can say that they are chosen by the state security in Egypt or the intelligence. Even there is a committee for human rights in the parliament. the director of this committee, he was former policeman who was accused with torture before. Can you imagine? Like, he is the president of the Human Rights Committee in the parliament itself. So you can understand how they would choose the members of the Human Rights Council.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Jawad, I now want to turn to you to speak about Bahrain. So the Bahraini National Human Rights Institution has status B, so showing partial compliance with the Paris principles. I'm pretty sure you're of the opinion that it shows no compliance whatsoever with the Paris principles. But yeah, I would love for you to share your concerns with us on the shortcomings of the institution.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and highly appreciated that you are focusing on this important issue. At the beginning, let me mention that it was a good approach by UN to start establishing some entities to give some platform for the NGOs to bring up their concern over human rights violations in their countries. And that's why Human Rights Council has been established 2008, and then we had this National Institute for Human Rights open. The Paris Principle has been already agreed on. But now is that if these two entities don't function well, and if they don't carry on all the objectives that these NGOs and the victims are requiring for their rights, I think that's going to be a deep failure of the entire system. Our judgment about how this National Institute for Human Rights are working, majority, especially on these dictatorship types of the governments like Bahrain, it is another whitewash and another folklore type, or a body that is not within the standards of the Paris Principle. For sure, Paris Principle based on mainly three pillars. It is basically on pluralism, independency, and effectiveness. So if we want to evaluate how the current National Institution of Human Rights in Bahrain is adequate to apply these ones, either by law or in practice, we can see far away. So our surprise is how even they got this B status to now to let them to reevaluate it to give them A status, because they are far away. Law-wise, they've been established in 2009 and 10th November 2009 by royal decree, and all the Council of Commissioners are being appointed by the king. And never ever they've been like representing any variety of the active NGOs in Bahrain or abroad. And at the same time, we can see that the type of the activities they carried on up to now, since their establishment till now, if we read all their reports, if we read all their press release, if we read all their statements, never ever solved any single complaints. For sometimes the victims and the victims' family, they try to address their complaint to the institute, but up to now, we never ever find out any types, neither backing them on their claim or criticizing even mild way to the authorities atrocities and human rights violations, nor trying to document it so clearly in the international events that they are present, or even sometimes if they wanted to make any proposal for amendment for the current or local legislations in the country. Here in the National Institution of Bahrain, for example, and the National Institute for Human Rights in Bahrain, we can find out that grave human rights violations occur since 2011. Death penalties, revocation of nationality, forcible deportation of those whose nationality has been revoked, systematic torture. We could see even sexual harassment for women in the jail. We could see a lot of abuse of the children's rights, women's rights, and so on. So all the grave human rights violation is so clear. Yet we cannot see any single approach of these types of the violations in Bahrain by National Institute of Human Rights. For sure, whatever government's policy is, they are echoing it. I think the latest prisoner strike, which was first time in the history of Bahrain, more than 800 prisoners gone on strike, demanding a basic demands, demanding, for example, to extend their time to go to the yard and sunshine instead of 1 hour, 2 hours, demanding that their Friday prayer to be all together, demanding that the glass barrier to be removed when they are meeting with their families, demanding the frequent visit to the medical centers, and so on. Even that one is not being received by National Institute of Human Rights so supportively and backing them. If we count, for example, of the absence of the president or banning the special rapporteurs to visit Bahrain, which yet no single special rapporteur visit Bahrain since 2006 till now. We cannot see any position within this National Institute of Human Rights to defend that or to call that to becoming that one. And meanwhile, whenever governments is trying to approach for any high violation types of the acts, for example, when they executed some youth and the political reasons, we never ever heard that they are condemning or they are demanding that the death penalty to be abolished at all. The terminology of the political of conscience, for example, it is very, very well known terminology in all our wars as an activist, human rights NGOs, and even in UN international bodies when they are discussing about the freedom of speech and detention of the activists if they are expressing their freedoms, word or freedom of assembly. Never you can find this word or this terminology in their literature, prisoner of conscience. So in short, I think that unfortunately, either through the practice or even by the law, it is one body of the similar decorative type of body. In Bahrain, for example, we have the special units, special investigation unit to find and look after any complaints by the victims. It is totally duplicating the Ministry of Interior's decisions. We have, for example, Commissioner of Prisoners. It is totally another fabricated or a decorative type of body. We have a National Institution of Human Rights, which, as we detailed and explained that how they are run, and so on. So all they are part of it. Let me mention here, lately, less than a month, the king wanted to give or indicate that the institute is independent by, instead of appointing the Council of Commissioners, he made amendment to the law where he assigned his Minister of King Court, to establish a committee to evaluate whoever want to candidate to be part of the council. The selection of member of this council, although it is open to the public, but the selection of the member will be in the hand in this committee, which chaired by the King Court Minister. So is it totally independent? For sure not. And at the same time, when we comes to their issues related to the Bahrain's should be oblique to what the UPR recommendation, for example, or any human rights bodies internationally being recommending Bahrain, either in the discrimination issue or in the nationality law or whatsoever. By the way, Bahrain's UPR recommendation for the last one, which was in November 2022, is increased to 245. And almost there was a clear and repeated recommendation by the states that National Institute of Human Rights to be independent. So that is another indication it is totally not independent. When we come to the personnels and who are in charge of this National Institute of Human Rights, I can mention two: the chairman, Ali Ad-Durazi, and his vice chairman, Khalid Al-Shar. Ali Ad-Durazi is running his own private company which was there a complaint by migrant rights group that he's abusing his labor, he's abusing his migrant workers, and they made complaint to him. How someone, when he's running his own business, not applying with the international standards to how to deal with the migrant workers, could be a safeguard or a neutral person to run National Institute? And when we come to the next man, his assistants, Khalid al-Sha'ar, clearly a few years back, he mentioned in a tweet that whoever opposed the king, they are deserved to be hanged. So is it really independence? It is really within the standards of the Paris principles? For sure not. So definitely we think that they don't deserve even B status, and they should even now evaluate to go back to C. We hope that maybe we can discuss it later on, what the action to be taken by the state. Once again, I can emphasize here, since the establishment of this institute till now, never ever they tried even to demand any amendment to the local legislations to be co-op or to be within the standard of international conventions which Bahrain signed internationally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jawad, for this overview of the very worrying worrying practices about the Bahraini NHRI. And I think overall what we see with Egypt and Bahrain is that on one hand, there is inaction, and when an institution is not doing anything to promote human rights or act on complaints of human rights violations, that's one thing. But I think what we see, and that is even worse, is when it feels like they're also complicit in human rights abuses and really siding with the government and like contributing to whitewashing human rights abuses on the ground. Mohammed, I actually want to turn back to you now and ask you what you think should be the steps that should be taken by the Egyptian Commission to ensure they're improving human rights on the ground. Or if I may ask, like, what do you think are actually some of the prerequisites that would be needed for this institution to actually play its role and, you know, be useful for Egypt and for the situation on the ground? And I guess because, as we mentioned, Egypt now has status A, and we, civil society, are asking that they be downgraded. Do you think that downgrading the NHRI could lead to change? Like, do you think they would be sensitive to that, or the authorities would kind of take this as, okay, we really need to do something now to regain our status A? Like, yeah, just wondering if you think there is kind of any hope and trying to like look ahead what could be done.
Look, first, I'm not sure actually if downgrading the Human Rights Council status will improve the situation in Egypt, because actually the Egyptian regime doesn't have a criteria for caring or not caring with the international community. Sometimes they care about their view in front of the international community or the European community. Sometimes they really don't care, because always there is some agreements under the table. So it's okay, even if you are talking about the Human Rights Council in Egypt or about the human rights strategy in Egypt, even if you say that Egypt have a lot of human rights violations, it's okay. We can deal with the presidents of European countries under the table, and everything will be okay after that. Sometimes they make some deals with weapons, with some economic agreements, and everything will be okay. Even maybe you know about the case of Giulio Regeni. Italy made some agreements with Egypt, and now they are not talking about Giulio Regeni at all. So always the Egyptian regime knows the solution for that. So maybe the downgrading of the status will push them to improve it, or to improve the independence of this council. Maybe not. So there is I can't be sure about that actually, because as I'm telling you, the Egyptian government doesn't have a criteria for that. But to ensure the independence of this council, or to improve their work, or to say that they can really control the human rights violations in Egypt, they can do like real rule in that, we can ask first that the Human Rights Council should be appointed independently, really, either with the government, from the government, or from the president, but we should really ensure their independence, that they can't be dismissed if they said opinion against the government. This is one of the ways. I don't think they will do that, but that's one of the ways. Give them more powers in like visiting the prisons without declaring, like it's not prepared before. They should have the right to visit the prisons at any time to see if there is any violations inside the prisons or not. Give them more powers in ratifying conventions related to human rights. This also would be really good. Give them the right to suggest laws or suggest amendments to the laws in Egypt, which is mainly now, since 2014, the government is trying to amend just to legalize the violations, not to protect the people from the violations. Like, as I'm telling you, since 2014, the government issued more than 1,400 laws. If you look at most of these laws, it's mainly made just to legalize the violations and to ensure the impunity for the perpetrators. If the Human Rights Council really wanted to be independent and to improve the human rights situation in Egypt, they should have the right to suggest amendment to these laws. This is, in my point of view, like some of the things we can do to upgrade the attitude or the status of the Human Rights Council.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. And now I want to turn again to you, Jawad, to ask you exactly the same question on Bahrain. Like, what would you hope as a Bahraini human rights defender for the NHRI to actually change to ensure that they're playing their role?
For sure, the similar way that Mohammed indicated, the first point is the total independency of this National Institute of Human Rights. The independency from the government, and shouldn't be part of the government previous employee or security staff or someone that already benefiting from the government policy. So total independency, it is a very, very critical and essential for any types of the approach to the true and within the Paris principles pillars that we want to establish here. The second suggestion is that they should be part of the human rights defenders. Whoever is active within either the commissions of, Council of Commissioners or any part of this institute should be having some experience and knowledgeable about the human rights principles, human rights values, and he should be experienced on it, and he should be shown as a credibility. They should be part of this long-run struggle to the right of the victims. They shouldn't come from any types of the security or military or diplomatic background, which they are now. So for sure, more they're gonna be part of this type of the community, human rights defenders community, more it will assure us that the values and the main objectives of the human rights issue will be respected, and they are totally gonna be independent. Third point, I believe that they should have a very strong relationship and coordination, either with the local NGOs, regional or international NGOs. That is a clear indication. If we find there is a very negative reputation where they are contacting the NGOs, for example, locally, regional, internationally, that indicates that they are far away from their principles. And for the National Institute of Bahrain, for example, rarely we can find, never ever they are in contact with any NGOs who are abroad. Rarely we can find they are in contact with the local ones, and even those local ones, which is already the authorities banned the independent NGOs like Bahrain Center for Human Rights. They are not allowing some NGOs like As-Salam for Democracy to be operated in Bahrain. They already established many Gongos NGOs to indicate that there are some NGOs but the independent NGOs, they are not in contact, they are not in consultation with. At the same time, I confirming that the High Commissioner's office, they are not that much happy about the performance of National Institute of Human Rights. So more they are far away of the coordination, more that indicates that they are totally independent and are not qualified to be. So there should be more cooperation. For sure, about the international conventions, amendment and ratifying the local legislations, and to be furthermore based on the human rights values. More they do, more they struggle for it, more they have their own campaign and advocacy with the parliamentarian to adopt it, more they criticize any right away human rights violation in the ground, more will give us more indication. So these are some standards I want to indicate about.
Thank you so much, Jawad. And I also want to remind our audience that there is a Q&A section. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Shamira, now that you've heard all of this, I want to turn back to you and ask you, so we also see, I mean, we obviously see a number of shortcomings with this NHRIs, but that also means that we need a review process that would also be more efficient and, more perhaps reflective of civil society views. So what would be your actual recommendations for the NHRI review system to be improved, and how can we make sure that our voices are heard, or what would we ask the SCA or the system as a whole to do in order for to get to that stage, basically?
Thank you, Ines. And I think hearing from the other panelists here, it feels like the challenges are similar no matter what part of the world you're in. And we're finding that there is a lot of similarities in the way some of the NHRIs are functioning. I also appreciate Jawad's point about instances where civil society and NHRIs are working together closely tends to see a very positive result in understanding the grassroots issues. And I think that has been a very strong factor for NHRIs, which have been working very well because they're more in touch with the people. If I can come back to the process itself, I think I would be able to provide very specific recommendations based on our experience. And I think the first one of these is that NHRIs are public institutions and they are institutions of the people. So it's very important to have a space in the accreditation process for more civil society engagement, possibly through a formalized space, you could say. So it's not just in terms of the reports that we're submitting, but also the space to interact directly with members of the SCA or the body itself to be able to present our concerns before them. Because as I mentioned earlier, it can feel one-sided if you are sending reports into what feels like a void sometimes, and you're not very sure what is the outcome of this. So for example, when civil society, we have to submit reports 6 months before the accreditation session. We don't always receive feedback. And what a formalized space of interacting with the SCA might do is for civil society to be able to speak directly with the body that is undertaking the accreditation, even if, say, the report is long or it hasn't been well read or it's not been received well. If there is a space within the accreditation session itself, then there might be a space to have the kind of conversation we are having today. A second recommendation would be regarding follow-ups. I think some of the colleagues over here have very specifically raised this point as well, and this is something I wanted to share as well. We do find that subsequent accreditations of NHRIs, so every 5 years or every 10 years, the SCA does raise similar recommendations for some NHRIs over a course of time, but we're finding that there's not a lot of follow-up on these recommendations. So recommendations might just be left at that. While you can request the NHRI to follow up, is there any concrete effort that some of the NHRIs take? We're not very sure about that. So it's important to know that there is some process to check whether these recommendations are actually being acted upon. And there should be some effort to ensure that NHRIs are being evaluated against their performance of following up on these recommendations. Otherwise, they're just words that you might have on a document which not anyone might do anything about. That brings me to my third recommendation here. So as civil society that has been participating in this process, we do find that initially the ICC, now GANRI, used to have the system of A, B, and C institutions, and now it's the binary of A status and B status institutions. However, as colleagues here have also shared, having an A status isn't necessarily implying that you're performing very well. So you might have some A status institutions which are doing wonderfully, and some which are really not doing that much. So what we as civil society have also been advocating for is some kind of a system where you say you're an A or an A minus, which means that an A minus is not necessarily at a B status institution. It's still compliant with the Paris principles to some extent, but yet it has some more room to work on some of its issues. There is still a lot of scope for it to act upon some of the Paris principles. And therefore, this kind of a nuance in the accreditation process could be very important for seeing who's really doing the work and who's got a lot more to catch up on. I know that my colleagues here also have raised the question of alibi institutions, and this is something we've seen in our work as well. Many times there are NHRIs which are operating as a front for authoritarian governments, and it becomes difficult to hold them accountable because they are a part of the human rights network. So what can be done in this regard? And I think the question is also about NHRIs holding each other accountable, not only simply through the accreditation process, but also about how they are or not engaging with these NHRIs in various platforms. So for example, regionally or internationally, do you agree to share space with an NHRI where you know that your counterpart has not been doing very well or has been supporting the government, or where there are issues? So this is also a question for NHRIs themselves. And my last point in this regard is that there has to be a system to protect HRDs and CSOs who are in challenging contexts and making these submissions to the GANRI SCA. So in countries where there are authoritarian regimes and governments, we know that NHRIs do not enjoy the independence that they should be working with. They don't have that sort of an autonomy, and sometimes they're also in agreement with their governments, or they're also subsumed under their governments entirely. So it can be challenging for civil society organizations in these contexts to make submissions to the SCA, knowing full well that the SCA does share civil society reports with the NHRI being evaluated and being accredited. So there could be a possibility for reprisals back home once the accreditation process is over. So I think that it's important if the GANRI SCA can take this into account, that a lot of CSOs and HRDs are really operating at risk. They need to be protected even in the accreditation system and process. And how can their recommendations, their reports be submitted without a backlash back home once the accreditation session is over? I think this is a very opportune moment to be talking about a lot of these issues, because we are seeing that this is the 30th year of the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Principles. And there is a lot to speak about in terms of we've come this far, but what else can we do to improve the process? I think Brian also mentioned earlier, we do have institutions like the UN, GANRI also exists. These mechanisms exist, but what can we do to sort of hold them accountable, to suggest reform, and try to ensure that civil society doesn't lose the very little space it enjoys right now, to try to also ensure that civil society is heard far more than they actually are. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamira, for these really excellent recommendations. I feel we can all agree on, and I think perhaps like some of the good examples that the SCA and GANRI as a whole could also look up to are the way, for example, the treaty body system work. When there is a country that's going to be reviewed, well, the state delegation obviously is the one, that's there during the interactive dialogue, but civil society also gets a chance to attend the review for one, but also brief the UN experts beforehand. And perhaps, if we're trying to think concretely into what we would like the SCA system to look like, this could be a recommendation. And also on the very important issue of reprisals, I think a lot of those UN bodies have tried to integrate that aspects into their work by having like focal points on reprisals, or mechanisms that are trying to also address that in case there is backlash after submission. But thank you. Those are really excellent recommendations. Brian, I now want to turn back to you. So obviously we've discussed a lot of issues today that have remained largely under the radar, and we civil society organizations could probably try to do more at both the kind of country NHRIs level, but also at the kind of holistic level as we've seen. And I'm curious to know what would your recommendations to civil society be to make sure we remain engaged?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Look, I think there are useful things that civil societies can do. I think it's very difficult to expect an independent, fully functioning, very useful NHRI to exist in the context of an authoritarian regime. The idea that, you know, a Bahraini or an Egyptian NHRI can really function like it's supposed to in the context of working in a dictatorship is just not true, right? That's not going to happen. I guess it's feasible for some brave people now and again, if they are in one of those bodies, to criticize the government and, you know, get ready for the consequences. But I don't think these things are fundamentally reformable in a context of a dictatorship. I just think it's impossible to have a normal NHRI in such an abnormal and oppressive human rights context. And I think that Shamira's point about the legitimacy of NHRIs and how other NHRIs interact with them is an important one, and something that civil society can also feed into. So if you think about the accreditation process, right, that's like the formal process for whether or not a particular NHRI, whether it's Bahrain or Egypt or anybody, gets its legitimacy. But as we've seen, that accreditation process is pretty ropey. But a less formal but also powerful way to either give or withhold legitimacy is how other governments interact with those NHRIs. So don't invite them to speak. Don't give them that legitimacy or that credibility by saying we're going to invite the vice chair or the chair or the member commissioner of the Egyptian National Human Rights Institute. Like, don't play that game, right? That just then gives them a credibility and legitimacy that they don't deserve. So don't interact on that level with them. You don't have to, if you are another government or another NHRI, recognize them just because they have an A or a B accreditation. And I think that that's something which civil societies can do, both in the country which might be considering getting into some sort of dialogue with one of these terrible NHRIs, or the civil society which already has enough on its plate, I know that, within those countries. So for the Egyptian civil society in this case, for instance, to be telling other governments, don't recognize our NHRI, the Egyptian government's recognize it's not real. Just because it goes waving around its A accreditation or its B accreditation, it doesn't make it real, and you're making it worse for us if you start inviting them to these sorts of conventions. Now, I understand Shamira's point around this, and you know, it's difficult if you have a club, these regional clubs of NHRIs, to ostracize the really bad ones. But unless they're going to feel some sort of rejection, some sort of political pain, then really you're complicit in that game of recognize them as legitimate NHRIs just because the accreditation system says they are. So I think more pressure from civil society to withhold the more informal but very powerful and useful credibility would be a useful thing for NHRIs to do. And look, some NHRIs are really pretty good, right? And you know, some are struggling. Another point that Shamira made was about whether or not NHRIs protect their own human rights defenders. The ISHR NGO did a very good comparative study of half a dozen West African NHRIs over the last few years, and some really have managed to pass laws and otherwise push for the protection of their own human rights defender communities. But that's a world away from what's happening in Egypt and Bahrain. I mean, these things are time wasting fakes. And you know, let's not pretend they're anything else except that. Very occasionally they might respond to a complaint, the Bahrain one now and again does something semi-useful, but by and large, they're just puppets of the government. And, you know, let's everybody say it out loud and not really bring them into a legitimacy of a credible human rights family.
Thank you so much, Brian. And indeed, a very good point to highlight is how, on one hand, it's good for NHRIs to seek accreditation, but on the other, accreditation, and especially having status A, does not necessarily mean that they're effectively independent. So as civil society, we also feel kind of that tension. And maybe just to give an example, the Saudi Human Rights Commission is not accredited, but yet, you know, is actually a meeting with, you know, a number of high-level officials in other countries and so on. And, you know, if we were to apply the kind of same rationale as Egypt, well, maybe tomorrow they seek accreditation and they get A status, and it doesn't mean that they should be engaging with those actors still. So it's a bit of a tricky situation that we are in, but definitely some important things that we should consider and continue to think about. We have less than 10 minutes to answer some of the questions by our audience. So Shamira, I want to turn to you first. So very practical question: who is going to be on the SCA panel for the upcoming review? Where is this information available? And does the recommendation of the SCA goes for final review and discussion at the GANRI level, or is the recommendation from the SCA just accepted as final?
Thank you, Ines, and thank you to whoever has asked those questions. I think when it comes to the SCA panel, I think there is information available. So you do have representatives from one of the 4 regions who will sit on the panel, as well as representatives from the 4 different NHRI networks in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia as well, Asia Pacific. And I think this information should be available on the OHCHR website and the GANRI website as well. When it comes to the recommendation of the SCA committee, it is, of course, the GANRI SCA, which is made of 4 members who will look into the review of the NHRIs. But to my knowledge as well, this is also shared with the GANRI Bureau, which is a body of 16 NHRIs looking into the functioning of other NHRIs as well. And then I think there is a discussion, there is feedback, and then the final report comes out, I think 3 weeks or 4 weeks after the accreditation session has taken place. So I hope that has answered the question.
Thank you so much, Shamira. And another one that's not directed, but perhaps Brian, you would like to take that one on whether the independence of the NHRIs is a factor in the actual evaluation, should it be?
Yes, it is, and yes, of course, it should be. And so then, you know, but the accreditation process then discredits itself and you know, undermines its own credibility when it gives A ratings to NHRIs like Egypt, which clearly is not independent. I mean, for an NHRI to work, really, it needs a buy-in from the government of the day that it's really going to be independent, but also of the main opposition parties. There's no point having an NHRI which is really only going to be independent while a certain political party is in power, and next year there's an election, it's going to lose its independence. You need a broad political consensus across a range of parties who are likely to be in government, that it's really going to be independent. But, you know, at least equally as important, it needs to have public credibility, that it really is independent. And those things need to be evaluated as part of a real accreditation process. And we just don't have, I don't think we have a trustworthy accreditation process at the moment, because it's giving out these certificates to NHRIs that clearly aren't independent. So yes, it's there. No, it's not being enforced, and it undermines the whole accreditation process, not just for the bad ones, but also for the good ones.
Thank you so much, Brian. And perhaps the last one for Shamira again. So the question is, I don't know how the structure works under GANRI, but for every state and every national body, inclusion of independent groups seems needed. Is that an impossible goal in terms of GANRI? And the person is also giving the example of England's National Human Rights Institution, which has been subverted by the government whereas an inclusive structure might have prevented this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you. I'm not very clear what the person has implied by independent groups, whether it's the commission itself or other bodies as well. But I think as far as the commission is involved, any commission, any NHRI, ensuring that the enabling laws or in practice, the NHRI is independent, is guaranteed that independence, has the space to be able to question even the government, because NHRIs are unique bodies. They're neither civil society and they're neither government. So it is important, certainly, to have that element of independence as part of its daily functioning, as part of its mandate, so that we do see in a lot of countries as well, where NHRIs have taken a position which is questioning the government, questioning those in power. And that really goes to show that it can subvert the pressure that authoritarian governments or governments that are unhappy with the situation of, say, the NHRI doing all this advocacy within the country, and NHRIs can withstand that if they are also enabled to do so in law. So I hope that answers the person's question as well.
Thank you so much, Shomira. And I unfortunately already have to come to a close for this webinar. I really want to warm all the panelists and audience for, especially for Brian and Shomira for waking up early and staying up late to be with us. We really appreciate it. And I also want to say that we will obviously be monitoring, whatever is going to unfold after the SCA review of Bahrain in Egypt. I also want to invite the audience, in case you want more information about this process or about the NHRI reviews in general, to contact us. And I'm sure Mohammed or Jawad would also be delighted to hear from anyone about Egypt and Bahrain in particular. And lastly, I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, so Freedom Initiative, Salam for Human Rights and Democracy, and ECRF, as well as Human Rights Foundation. Thank you so much for making the time and these great conversations. And I also hope we can take this forward and continue acting both for NHRIs in the MENA to be working towards more independence and impartiality, but also, as we said, not forget the need to also act at a more holistic level and also try and improve the whole review system of the ACA. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you, and wish you a great rest of your day wherever you are.